Well, welcome everyone. Tonight we are going to have a wonderful presentation with Gabriela Cesarino and Susan McAninley. It's the immigration station of Philadelphia's Ellis Island, Pier 53 on Delaware River. So thank you for joining our event, our presentation. And without further ado, I'll just pass the word to Jill Weber. She is our board president. Take it over, Jill.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are now a couple events into what is it actually our 130th season. So that's a big deal. Welcome everyone, and you know it's obviously a little bit of a shock to the system still that we are doing this on Zoom, but there you go. But I want to just give a little introduction to tonight's event, and it is our 130th season. Now, we do look to the past quite a bit, and we're building on our last two seasons, which basically were The World Begins in Philadelphia. And this year, we planned the season and our events during the pandemic. We were already in the midst of a pandemic. And so we really thought, you know, this is a really good time. We can't travel. I'm looking at these faces. I know a lot of you thrive on travel as I do. We can't travel. We're kind of, you know, stuck at home, but we're still seeking out each other. And so now is the time to kind of seek out people and travel and various things, maybe more intellectually or perhaps through some history, perhaps just seeking out interconnections in any way that we can. I was really struck by the start of this meeting and how everybody who got on was like, oh hi, you know, oh hi, you know, everybody was so happy. There was really quite a joy in reconnecting with people we know now. And so it really is a thrill to think, I think we did this right. I think the focus on our past, on immigration, on interconnectivity with who's come to Philadelphia, how we fit into the world, how our ancestors came to Philadelphia and fit into this world was a good one. You know, I think it's something that resonates with a lot of people because, of course, we are American, which means, you know, maybe a lot of us have relatives who came through the Philadelphia port or Ellis Island or one of these major ports. Maybe this is an inspiration to dig into that past a little bit, or just to talk to other people, use it as a way to connect to family, connect to friends, connect to each other, again, at a time when we can't travel much as we want to. This is the way we travel, and I think it is a very, very wonderful way to do so. So I'm really thrilled, and we've had events with a young woman from South Korea who now sings in Philadelphia, and I did a wine tasting on you know, basically wines from ancient worlds that transferred the knowledge and technology about wine to other worlds. And of course, our Marco Polo, that always brings us and other cultures to us and us to other cultures. But this is one where we can really connect to our past. So I want to introduce Gabriela, who's going to tell you a little bit more about tonight's event. And in fact, she's going to start tonight's event. So Gabriela, you are muted still, Gabriela. There you go.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen, if that's okay with you. Is it good?
Perfect.
Okay, so good evening. First, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I think this should be a really interesting conversation about the Philadelphia Immigration Station and all the people who arrived there at the turn of the 20th century. I'll give you a brief introduction to the location of the immigration station, which was referred to at the time as an emigrant station. And then I'll hand it to Susan. We're going to focus on the past today. And if there's enough interest, We can plan another presentation and talk about current plans and the development along the river and of this area. So in interest of time, so taking advantage of having Susan with us today, I will not talk about planning tonight, but I could do so at another time. With that, I ask you to imagine that we're going down Washington Avenue towards the Delaware River. And then you cross Columbus Boulevard and you see on your left the US Coast Guard facilities. And to your right, the two buildings of the Sheet Metal Workers Union. Right behind the two sheet metal workers buildings is Washington Avenue Green, which is a park and a recreational trail that now occupies Pier 53. This park was planned as part of the 2011 Delaware River Master Plan. It was developed by the River Waterfront Corporation, and it was designed with the idea of reconnecting the city to the river. As you can see, all these dark green areas, those are all the new plans. And the idea was to reconnect to the city with a network of parks, trails, attractions, and also with the objective of promoting development along the Delaware. The plan has been implemented in sections since then. As Susan was just telling us, the areas that are of public property were a little easier to start, and that's why Washington Avenue Green was one of the first ones to be developed. And the areas that have private developers, a few of them are still under discussion, but we could talk about that another time. So going back to the past, the street that runs along the Delaware River was an informal path that connected the several docks and piers along the waterfront until the 1830s. In 1831, Stephen Girard, the banker, left $500,000 from his fortune for the city to transform the path into a big boulevard. The first section of Delaware Avenue was completed in 1839. Today, the roadway, as we know, runs from the Walt Whitman Bridge to the Betsy Ross Bridge. In 1992, the southern section up to Spring Garden Street was renamed Christopher Columbus Boulevard. And that seems to have been a request by some Italian Americans. Maybe Susan can tell us more about that. I know some descendants of the Lenape tribe did not like that change of name. Because they associated themselves more with the name of Delaware, which is still not from their language. But anyway, that's a story in itself, which I'm not going to get into today. So this is a view of the Delaware River in 1887. At that time, Philadelphia was the second largest city in the country and a thriving industrial center. And so it attracted immigrants from various parts of the world, mostly from Europe. From 1873 until 1896, the vast majority of immigrants came from Western and Northern Europe, Irish, Welsh, English, and Germans. After 1896, Southern and Eastern European immigrants became the majority: Italians, Poles, Hungarians, Russians, and others. During the early 20th century, up to the First World War, the station received an average of 50,000 immigrants per year. Some of those immigrants remained in the city, sharing the industrial neighborhoods with the Irish, the English, the Germans, and the African Americans that had arrived earlier. Others boarded the Pennsylvania Railroad trains that lined up on the Delaware Avenue and rode out to the mill and coal towns throughout Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic region. The Immigrant Center processed over 1 million immigrants who entered the US, many who were fleeing from devastating poverty and other issues, some discrimination and things, the Jews, etc. At the height of its activity between 1910 and 1914, the port was the third largest in the nation. The construction of the immigration station in Philadelphia was part of a strategic plan that was developed by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And the idea was to compete with the New York Central Railroad. The PNC, as they called, intended to steer the immigrants away from New York.
Hi, Kath.
I'm sorry? Can you hear me?
I can't, I'm sorry.
Okay. So the idea was to steer the immigrants away from New York and distribute them across the industrial lands which the Pennsylvania Railroad served. The plan worked, and within a few years, the corporation increased their profits by 40%. The integration between the ships and the railroad helped the business, and it became the largest railroad by traffic and by revenue in the US throughout the first 2/3 of the 20th century, and one of the largest corporations in the world. This area along the river was packed with factories, warehouses, sugar refineries, grain elevators, and people. Everything was connected to the yards of the railroad. Just outside the immigration station, crowds gathered, offering services to the newly arrived. People were looking for their families. They're getting ready to board the trains. They're looking for opportunities. Many immigrants chose to stay, and their descendants are scattered throughout the city. And in 1915, the Washington Street structure was torn down. It was supposed to be rebuilt by the federal government. But with the drastic reduction in immigrants during World War I and the strict laws of, in relationship to the immigration of the 20s, the pier was never rebuilt. Let's see. So now I would like to welcome our guest, Susan McAninley, who will speak to you in more detail about the time when the immigration station was in operation, and mostly about the people who arrived through its doors. Susan is a Philadelphia native. She has a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of the Arts, and she has worked as an art director, as a designer, a teacher, a writer, and a radio talk show producer. Although a graphic arts by profession and training, she has long had an interest in genealogy. The Pier 53 project is something she started in 2012, when the Washington Avenue Green Park was officially opened, just a year after the big plan was approved. Since she lives close by, she became interested in the local history of the waterfront. It was then that she found out that both of her grandfathers arrived in the US on Pier 53. Since then, Susan has been collecting stories of some of the millions of immigrants, 1 million, some of the million of immigrants who arrived between 1876 and 1926. Today, Susan is going to share with us the story of Pier 53 and some of the results of the story she collected over the past 8 years. Susan also recently received a grant to develop a short movie, an 8-minute movie about Pier 53. And she has promised to let us know when it's released, sometime early next year. And so now I'll ask you to please join me in welcoming Susan McAninley. And now we have to have her share her screen. Susan? And I'll mute myself.
Okay.
Susan, yes, good to go. Thank you.
I am looking for, where is it? Oh, hold on. It worked before.
Yes.
Here we go. Can everyone see that?
Not yet, Susan.
No. Should be a tab on the bottom of
There
it.
you go. Oh, no. And
On the bottom, it should say share screen.
I've done that.
yeah, we just tested. Let's see if Gabriela, you did stop sharing, correct? Yeah, you did. Okay.
Just make sure, Susan, that when you do hit share screen and then the other options come up, you then again hit share.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
You got it.
Got it? Can everyone see that? I hope.
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
This is an indication it's sort of a Photoshop pastiche of what the station looked like in the place where it actually was. It's on Washington, at the foot of Washington Avenue on Delaware/Columbus Boulevard, right next to the Coast Guard station. And that's exactly where it was located. It was right smack up against the street, and railroad tracks ran in front. Okay. Come on. There we go. That's, whoops. All right. That's what it looks like now without the rendering. Very similar to Gabriela's picture. I think it was probably taken around the same time because of the foliage. And brief history of the area. Here's where it is. It's accessible by walking through the Sheet Metal Workers Building and the Coast Guard Station. The entrance is at the foot of Washington Avenue at Columbus Boulevard in South Philadelphia. The landmark nearby is Old Swedes Church. It's cat a corner, diagonally across from the pier entrance. And this is a Google map. Now, it has an interesting history, which a lot of people don't seem to know. It was active during the Revolutionary War, and it was a battery. It was a garrison that was called upon to defend Philadelphia. It was financed by a lottery that was initiated by Benjamin Franklin, and it involved guns and cannons to keep the Philadelphia safe from marauding invaders who were coming up the Delaware Bay. And since the city was run by Quakers at the time, nobody wanted to get involved in anything that involved guns. So he actually developed a lottery, and the lottery financed the garrison. This is about like 1840. Nothing really was happening south of South Street. The neighborhood was called Southwark. It was south of South Street and north of Mifflin Street, what is now Mifflin Street. It comprises the area between, it's 19147 and 19148 zip codes. This is the area right around the pier, what is now Queen Village and Pennsport. There was a shipbuilding area right next to where Pier 53 is now. It was the Joshua Humphrey shipyard, and they were very active. The two big structures there accommodated the high four-masted ships that they built there. And that's the two large buildings to accommodate the high masts and rigging. It was a local neighborhood attraction and open to the public. It was said that George Washington would go with his generals, and they would just kind of wander around there on a Sunday afternoon. It was also the first Navy Yard of the United States. It expanded to encompass the area now occupied by Pier 53 and southward to Pier 56, which is now a ruined pier. They just took over the whole neighborhood, and that was the first naval yard in the United States. And then during the Civil War, it became a first line of defense. And again, here's the shipyard, but it was now a Navy yard. And it was Civil War headquarters. Troops were assembled in 1861 at the pier, at the Navy Yard, what was then the Navy Yard, and marched up Washington Avenue to Broad Street, where they took the train to go to the Battle of Richmond and fight the Battle of Richmond. And then in 1865, a lot of them came back both by train and by boat, and they assembled again in this area. And there were these comfort stations that were manned by local neighbors who looked after the sick and ailing and recuperating soldiers, made them coffee, made sandwiches. It was quite the place. After people recuperated, they were put on trains and they were sent wherever, west or south or north. But there were all kinds of troops, and they stayed as troops. So there were Hessian troops who were there, and there were Zouaves, I think that's how it's pronounced, Zouaves, Z-O-U-A-V-E, all in costume, and they all assembled where the Navy Yard was and where Pier 53 is now. And then the Navy Yard moved to larger quarters. They ran out of space. They had an 11-acre site. They moved to much larger quarters. They sold the site to the Pennsylvania Railroad for $1 million, which was considered not a lot of money for that strategic site. And in January 1876, it became an immigration station. The Pennsylvania Railroad initially envisioned it as a site for freight depot and terminal, but for mostly non-human freight. But as immigration was increasing, the human freight, the railroad cars could be used for transporting people. And this is what it looked like. This is an 1870 photograph. It was called the Immigrants Station. And you can see the train tracks coming out of the building itself. The railroad built finger piers. This was Stephen Girard's doing. And there were finger piers all along the waterfront, wharves and granaries, sugar refineries, all kinds of buildings, storage, along with the piers. In 1876, the Pennsylvania Railroad cut a deal with the American Line and the Red Star Line, and they had offices nearby. And they recruited heavily. They did advertising overseas, and they set up this chain of agencies where a person could buy a ticket to Philadelphia from an office in Antwerp or Dublin or Frankfurt, and then come in to the city, and then they could actually continue on a train that ran right outside of the station and go wherever. Some of the immigrants stayed in the city, many took trains, and they left every couple of hours. So this was an immigration station, but it was also a railroad terminal, and which also handled freight. So it was a very busy area. And this is a picture that you saw earlier. This is fascinating. The ships came in, each had their own wharf. The American Line, you see, the Red Star Line. The ships were anywhere from 320 to 620 feet long, depending on the steamship line. And they came in on each of their piers, but all of those piers connected to the Immigration Pier, which was officially Pier 53, Pier number 53 north, or south, I'm sorry. But that's how they came in, and it was a very busy area. Some were sailing ships. Usually the first ships that came in the 1880s were hybrids. They were steam powered, but it was actually cheaper to cross the Atlantic if you used sails, if you knew what you were doing. So they would use sails until they got to the Delaware Bay, to Cape Henlopen. And then the Delaware Bay was very hard to maneuver using sails. So the sails went down, and the shipping, the navigation was done by steamship, by steam power. This is from one of their advertising brochures. This is the copy that was on the brochure. You see the ramp. People came from the ramps of their different stations where they came in, and into the main area. And this was says immigrant depot. This was one big floor. There were horses and carriages, and you could send a telegram, you could meet your family, and there were records of people meeting members of their family right here at this depot. And this was the inside of an immigrant car. That's how they described it. They're well ventilated, furnished with cushioned seats, cushioned backs, water stoves, like water closets, other such accommodations. So they were advertising not only coming to Philadelphia, but the comfort of the trains once you got there. The names of the 3 steamship lines were noted on the facade. This is the newly built building. They put in a second floor in the new building. This is different from the first building you saw, the Emigrant Station. It now says Immigrant Station, and the names of the 3 steamship lines that serviced it are mentioned. It's the American Line, which originated in Liverpool, and usually Liverpool and stopped at Queenstown in Ireland, which is now Cork, called Cork, or Cove. The Red Star Line originated in Antwerp, Belgium, and the Hamburg American Line originated in Hamburg, Germany, and Naples in Italy. And there was another steamship line that joined them in around 1910, and it was the North German Lloyd Line, which wasn't mentioned very much. It didn't come in that often, but there were accommodations for that line. It was demolished in 1915 with the plan to rebuild a larger and more modern building, but it didn't happen. The reason it didn't happen is because of the First World War. Passenger service had been pretty much eliminated. A lot of the passenger lines had been retrofitted into troop ships. Most of the immigrants were from Northern Europe early on. And there were approximately 1 million passengers overall who arrived through the Immigration Station Pier from 1876 to the mid-20s. And then the majority of later immigrants were from Southern and Eastern Europe. And here's this absolutely wonderful picture. I don't know who these people are or where they were coming from, but I just love those faces. And they came to Philadelphia. Now, immigration to Philadelphia had already been established. The Quakers, who came in the 17th century, had Irish servants. And many people came from Europe to fight in the American Revolution. And the Hessians, of course, had a foothold in the city by the 18th century, and they were responsible for all the very good beer that we now have today in Philadelphia. They came to Philadelphia. This is a map in 1854, and they arrived before the Immigration Pier. There were many mercantile ports along the Delaware River, and passports were not required. So you could just come in on a freighter, walk off, and you would be in Philadelphia, you would be in America. But it created a problem because a lot of the people who were coming in were not terribly responsible, and there were no prohibitions on their entering the city or entering the country. So a lot of them were concentrated in the Southwark area, which is now Queen Village and Pensport. Those 2 areas around Philadelphia are some of the oldest continuously inhabited areas in the country. Here's what it looked like in 1854. And you can see Southwark down there somewhere, very small, next to the Moyamensing district. The Moyamensing was actually a Lenni Lenape word, and it had been called Moyamensing at one point. And then the area around Pier 53, the area on which Old Swedes Church was built, was called Wekico, and that name still exists down in South Philadelphia. There's the Wekico Avenue or Wekico Avenue, which means a pleasant place. But the Southwark district, because of the naval, the Navy Yard and the garrison, it took the name from a part in London, which also had a similar configuration. So much for Southwark. This is an interesting photo. I don't know if any of you have seen this. This is from 1870, and it's a classic photo taken from the shot tower with someone who must have marched up to the top of the tower with glass plates and took a 360-degree panorama, actually 4 shots of the city of Philadelphia as it looked in 1870. And this was the Immigrant Pier at the time. And here's the city around it. And it was a crowded neighborhood. In 1910, the 3rd Ward, part of what is now known as Southwark, had a density of 130,000 people per square mile. That's what it looked like. And there were people living in lean-tos. There were people who lived in basements and sub-basements. And when you look at the census reports around 1910, there are like several families living in one house. And who were these people? No one knows the exact number of immigrants came in on that pier, but it's about 1 million, either 10 less than 1 million or 10 more than 1 million. And they're all from Europe. Some of the earliest people, this is interesting when you look at the passenger reports. In 1876, there were artisans who came in from different parts of Europe, and they came in expressly to work on the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Fairmount Park. Right, I think I dropped something. Yeah, the peak year for immigration into Philadelphia was 1913. Now, here's where you get into the stories of these people. They're ordinary people, just ordinary people. They weren't extraordinary people. They weren't geniuses. They were people who were leaving their country for any one of a number of reasons. In my family, I have an Irish grandfather who left because he was the youngest of a huge number of children, and there was just no work on the farm. And he left. He came with 2 of his brothers and a sister, and they just established a life for themselves in Philadelphia, raised families here. So I'm the granddaughter of an immigrant that came from Ireland, and the other grandfather came from Germany, and his parents did not want him serving in the Prussian army. The family was from Bavaria, so they came as draft dodgers. And then there are the stories of the people fleeing the pogroms in Eastern Europe, poverty, starvation in Italy. There were terrible famines in Italy, and religious persecution, of course, the Jews. The interesting thing is that the people who left for a specific reason, either because they were politically they couldn't practice politics in their own country, they were starving, or they were denied education because they were Jews, came in with a vengeance. And when they became American citizens, like my grandfather, he opened a bar where he got involved in politics, and he became very strong Catholic. And there were things that he could never have been able to do in Northern Ireland. The people from Sicily who were going through famines and droughts started restaurants in Philadelphia. And religious persecution, there were all these wonderful little synagogues, like almost every other block. There was a Jewish quarter in Philadelphia. I don't know if anybody knew that. I just found this out when I started this project. The locations in Europe, the years of immigration were influenced by many factors. And then there were increasing restrictions and quotas after World War I, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. Now, here's a little pie chart of the distribution of immigrants from Northwestern Europe and Southeastern Europe. So between 1881 and 1890, most of the immigrants were from Northern Europe, specifically Britain, Ireland, and Western Europe. And then the Chinese exclusion laws were put into effect, and there were no Chinese that were allowed to immigrate into the United States. That affected mostly the West Coast and not here. Checking through passenger lists, I found only one Chinese person that ever came into the United States, and he was returning. He had a Chinese restaurant in Philadelphia, and he was born in China, but he lived here, so they let him in. He wasn't a foreigner. Because of the terrible things that were happening in Southwark, all these loathsome masses who were coming in with no passport, no job, they just wanted to be here. The Department of Justice started applying these different laws, and you could not come into the US if you had certain medical conditions, one of which was trachoma, which was an eye disease, or you could not have a loathsome or dangerous disease. They had a board of inquiry that stopped people that looked like they might have been diseased or had medical problems. And in some cases, they were sent back if they were deemed unworthy of coming into the United States. And it wasn't a moral decision that they had so much as they didn't want the person to become a public charge. From 1891 to 1900, things were getting really unstable in Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe. And there were a flood of immigrants that started coming in from Southeastern Europe, and they outnumbered the people from Northwestern Europe. Immigration was in increasing numbers. Immigrants from countries, Russia and Italy, Southern and South Central Europe, outnumbered the immigrants who came earlier from Western Europe. There were pogroms that were happening, that were starting in Eastern Europe, and that just created an overwhelming rush of Jewish immigrants here. Now, in 1901 to 1910, there was the Japanese government, that was not a concern of the Philadelphia Piers, but they voluntarily limited Japanese immigration to the United States. It was called the Gentleman's Agreement. The Philippines, this is interesting, was an American colony, but the citizens were considered American nationals, and there was no restriction among Filipinos. 1913 saw the greatest volume of immigration. 1917, the US Congress enacted the first widely restrictive immigration laws. And there were a lot of things that were happening, and you see parallels in what's happening today. Because of World War I, there was an increasing, well, America had been, before World War I, had been very, very isolated. Didn't really think of themselves in terms of being part of the world. After the First World War, they did see themselves as part of the world. They supplied armaments and they participated in the First World War, but there was this growing national distrust of foreigners, and restrictions started to be placed on immigrants. So now it was necessary to be able, you had to be able to read. You didn't have to be able to read English, but you had to have reading comprehension in your own language up to the age of, well, 16 is when that was the cutoff point. After 16, you had to demonstrate reading comprehension. And new immigrants were levied a higher tax than previously. And they were basically sort of trying to close down the immigration. There was an essay in 1910, I can't remember, it was called The Closing of the American Frontier. And Frederick Jackson Turner, was that his name? And he wrote an essay saying, the frontier is closed. We really don't have a frontier anymore. We had, but in 1910, the frontier is closed. 1921, there were all these funny little quotas that were set. There was the Johnson-Reed Act. There were two of them. included the National Origins Act and the Asian Exclusion Act, which actually had already existed. But the National Origins Act, they said, we will allow in a certain number of people, but they have to be the same percentage of people that were in the United States in 1900. So of course it skewed towards people from Northwestern Europe. And then they changed it and made it stricter so that it had to represent the people who were in the country in 1920, I think it was 1921. So or 19, wait a minute, it was 1890, okay, and then 1900. They made it, the first was 1900, and then it was the percentage of people living here in 1890, which of course were mostly from Northern and Western Europe. And this is fascinating. The US Department of Justice in 1883 said, we're going to identify these people that are coming in by race. And this is how it was worded. Race or people is to be determined by the stock from which the aliens sprang and the language they speak. This is the exact wording. The original stock or blood shall be the basis of the classification independent of language. The mother tongue is to be used only to assist on determining the original stock. And here are the races. The Italians, if you were from the north, you were considered a separate race than if you were from the south of Italy. And there was a discrimination against Southern Italians. They were simply called South. And they were considered non-white in many cases because they came from Sicily. They were a little darker than everybody else. The English were considered a race all by themselves, as were the Irish. They were two totally different races and distinguished as such from each other. Montenegrin, Moravian, Ruthenian, these were vestiges of some of the tribes and ethnic groups that settled all through Europe, and they retained this identity, like Ruthenian or Montenegrin. Magyar, I think, was another one. Scotch, the Scotch were, which should be called Scots actually, but they called them Scotch. They were considered a race separate from the Irish and separate from the English, as were the Welsh. They were considered a fourth race. They were totally different from the other three. Scandinavian, even though they spoke different languages, were all grouped into one group. So you could be Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish, or you could speak each one of those languages, but you would just be put under the rubric of Scandinavian. However, if you were returning to the United States and you were a citizen, you were identified simply as American. And where did they come from? Well, it depends on what year it was. In 1876, this is what the map of Europe looked like. There was no Finland, no Poland. Russia owned just about everything. And the Ottoman Empire shared the rest, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire shared the rest. Ireland, Scotland, and Wales were all considered part of England. There was an Austrian-Hungarian Empire and an Ottoman Empire, and huge Russia. And then, in 1926, the Great War changed everything forever, and the Treaty of Versailles divvied up the countries in different ways. And now Ireland was the Irish Free State. It was different from Northern Ireland, which is still part of England, still is. And then Poland finally got its own country back, even though Poland had existed in various forms for thousands of years. And now Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Austria and Hungary were two different countries. Poland reemerged as a separate country. In Austria and Hungary, there were also people like Magyars and Croats and Serbs, all the people that you hear about now that now have their own countries. They all existed within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And these are the steamship routes. You can see the Red Star line comes from Antwerp. The Hamburg American line comes from Hamburg. There were trips from Glasgow, although they didn't really come into Philadelphia. Some of them did. Southampton, which was England, and Cork. They'd stop by at Cork to pick up Irish passengers. And then Naples, what was the furthest, the most southernmost port. And they all came to Philadelphia. And you can see how far north these ports are to Philadelphia. Boston was the closest. New York was closer than Philadelphia. And to come to Philadelphia, it was necessary to go all the way down to Cape Henlopen, Cape May, and come up the Delaware Bay. And it took a day. Once you came out of the ocean and into the bay, it took a day to get to Philadelphia. It's 100 miles. So Boston and New York were much closer. And here are those immigrants again. I love those faces. And where did they go? They came to Philadelphia. Before the 1890s, it was the most popular immigration port in America. In 1892, Ellis Island became much larger than Philadelphia. New York had the advantage of being 2 days closer, had the Erie Canal, but because of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Philadelphia had the distinction of being 1 day closer to the west. So if you were coming from Frankfurt, or Frankfurt, okay, and you came by way of the Red Star line, and you were actually heading out to Nebraska, you would come to Philadelphia. Even though it took an extra day or two to get to Philadelphia, you could get right on a train right outside of the station and head off to Nebraska. You'd have to make a couple of stops. You'd probably stop in Chicago, but you could get by train to Nebraska. And there were a couple of people who did that. There were some people who came from Norway who went right to Nebraska. They were farmers. They had farms out there. And you couldn't do that from New York. And this was the ad that they ran, touting the American line, Philadelphia and Liverpool, Pennsylvania Railroad. Every Tuesday, ship leaves every Thursday from Philadelphia to go back. Of course, these ships would also return. It was thought, I was reading a diary by a group that came from Russia to flee the pogroms, and they chose Philadelphia because it was cheaper, but also because there was a rumor that it was easier to get into America if you came through Philadelphia than through Ellis Island. I don't know if that was true or not, but that was what people thought. This is an immigrant train, and this is how they advertised it. And this is amazing. They owned or controlled, this is in the 1880s, over 6,000 miles of railroad, giving them direct and independent lines to all the great business cities of the United States. And this was the Pennsylvania Railroad. And this is where they went. This is a map from the 50s, but it pretty much establishes how far these places, how far flung their network was. I was reading a diary of someone who came from northern England and got on the train as soon as they got out of Philadelphia and went to Cincinnati. And they went to Cincinnati right away. They never even stayed in Philadelphia. They just routinely got on the train. And they came and went a couple of times. There were about 2 or 3 trips, and that's exactly what they did. They met their friends in Philadelphia. They had dinner, and then they got on the train to go to Cincinnati. The Great War, many of the steamships were taken out of service because they were turned into troop carriers. And then after the war, they were refitted and repurposed. Now, the SS Haverford, which was the bolt bus of the American line, this was a liner that went from Liverpool, okay, Liverpool to Queenstown, to sometimes Queenstown, Cork, and then to Philadelphia. And it made the trip twice a month. And it brought a lot of Irish immigrants, but also people who wound up in Liverpool because they wanted to come to America. So many of them were from Europe. Most of them were from Ireland and England, but a lot of others were from Central Europe. And this was, I forget exactly how big it was. I think it was like 470 feet. It wasn't one of the very big ones, but it was turned into a passenger. It turned away from the passenger line and became a troop carrier, and it suffered damage during the First World War. And then it returned to Pier 53 in 1919 to return troops to the United States. And this is actually an ad from a 1919 newspaper from the Public Ledger. And at the bottom it says, "Back from France, first stop Philadelphia." And it brought tons of people, doughboys, in on Pier 53, as well as a lot of the other piers in South Philadelphia. But people were just coming in by the thousands. There was one account on this date, June 8th, 1919, when the Haverford came in, and there were 2,000 troops on the one ship. By 1895, the area around the pier was dominated by freight lines and depots. And the people, this is from a 1919 ad for, I think, Lit Brothers or something. I think it's such a great illustration. There was already an established immigrant population. South Philadelphia had a large Jewish and Italian population by the 1850s. And then the ethnic groups tended to settle in neighborhood enclaves. The Lithuanians had a neighborhood enclave. One of the passengers came and was from Montenegro, I think. There was a Montenegrin neighborhood in Philadelphia. And they settled around the churches. And there were cultural institutions that welcomed these people. Let's see, I'm going back again. All right. A few went home. The Italians, 72% of the Italians went back, but they didn't always stay back. They came back. In many cases, they went back to Italy, picked up members of their family, got married, had children, brought their children back into the United States. But 72% of the Italians, I understand, actually went back. So you would see their names on the passenger lists going in and out, back and forth. There were protective neighborhoods, institutions, study of the census records, and this is fascinating because the first generation of immigrants became Americanized very, very quickly, and in many cases changed their names and anglicized the names. So Johann became John, Maria became Mary. The children of immigrants spoke English, but the parents spoke whatever language from their country. So the kids tended to be bilingual and better educated than their parents because we're simply more opportunities, especially if you happen to be Jewish and you're where you came from, the Jewish people were not allowed to attend university. The Jewish families were very, very intent on having their children be well educated, and it was a cultural thing. It's much like Chinese, I guess, now. This is a great thing. This was a group of people in front of St. Philip Neri Church, which is in my neighborhood, and I don't know when it was taken. I suspect around 1919. My guess is the armistice, right after the armistice, because of the way people were dressed. The women were wearing long skirts, but then they were also wearing short skirts as well. And 1919 was the time that women started wearing short skirts. But they're obviously very patriotic. They've got American flags, and they have a tricolor, big tricolor flag in the back. And I don't know if that's the Italian flag or the Irish flag. it's black and white. It's impossible to tell. I wish I knew. After the war, there were increasingly severe immigration restrictions, tariffs, literacy requirements, and then the exclusion laws, such as the Johnson-Reed Act. And then immigration slowed. The station was no longer needed. And the medical inspections and processing were done on the ships as they arrived at the piers. So it wasn't necessary for people to come off the ships and be processed at the pier. That was done on the ships. And then during World War II, Pier 53 was used briefly to ship supplies to Europe. And then it became a municipal pier. Now, the larger ships could be accommodated further south, but the smaller ships came into Pier 53, and it was still a mercantile pier. It was very, very busy. And then in June 5th, 1965, a tragic fire of mysterious origin burned the 700-foot-long structure at Pier 53, along with the oil drums stored there. People that I've talked to said they remembered that, and it was like the burning of Dresden. It was really scary. It just almost the whole neighborhood had sparks being sent through, and people were afraid their houses would burn down. It was a magnificent fire, as you see here. And then, after 1965 up until 2008, nothing happened. And then we had I-95. It isolated the river from the rest of the city. And Columbus Boulevard was widened. So you couldn't get to the river from the neighborhood. Before, people lived right at the edge of the neighborhood. They could walk to the waterfront, and now you couldn't do it. Someone described, it's just a wonderful description, that the waterfront was the retreating glacier of Philadelphia's industrial past. The original waterfront, not only true of Pier 53, but all the other piers as well, had just been abandoned. The larger ships were coming in, they could be handled further south. And the piers collapsed and rotted. But in 1972, there was the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, known as the Clean Water Act. And I think in 1974 was the Clean Water Act. So it changed the chemistry of the river. And ironically, the cleaned up Delaware River water gradually rotted the wooden piers that had been long preserved by the now banned chemicals. So all these wooden piers that had remained intact because they were covered in creosote or whatever happened to have been emptied further upstream, now started to rot because the water was cleaner. Okay, now here's what Pier 53 looked like up until a few years ago. In 2008, the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation initiated the master plan. And initially, this was the master plan, and then they've been working on it. And it went through different iterations. And they thought, well, this will now make the riverfront accessible so that tourists can come and pedestrians can actually walk there, and bicyclists. And so Washington Avenue Green was the first developed as the city of Philadelphia owned the 1 acre site. A lot of the other sites were owned by developers. And in some cases, nobody knew who owned the sites because they had been held in corporations and then they had been flipped and nobody knew who had bought them. The ownership of many of these parcels was very complicated. But this is fascinating. And this is going in the film. Attached to the site was the forgotten Pier 53. It had been overgrown with mulberry trees but remained intact. Now, the history of the mulberry trees is that they were foreign invaders. They're not native to America. They were brought in. And it was the mulberry trees that took hold on this ruined pier and kept the pier intact. So, wonderful metaphor that the foreign invaders were responsible for keeping the pier together. And the only indication that this had been an immigration pier was a sign right at the site, right on at the fence line at Washington and Delaware. And the Applied Ecologic Services was the group that was tasked with redeveloping the pier. They had to evaluate what they were going to do with the pier. It was ruined. It looked just as the picture you'd seen with all the mulberry trees. And the consultants didn't know it, but they were surprised it had been an immigration pier. Nobody remembered. It was like some alternate universe. Everyone had forgotten the significance of this place. And then a few of the people working on the project had ancestors who arrived in America. They didn't know that. This film that I'm working on, we were actually surprised to find this out, that so many of the people we knew that lived in the neighborhood, that lived in Pennsport and Queen Village, had no idea that their grandparents or great-grandparents had arrived in America. They were living 5 blocks away from where their ancestors came into America, and they didn't know it. The only evidence of the pier's history was a sign at the corner, and that was put up during the bicentennial in 1976, and it's still there, and it identifies it as the site of the immigration pier. Now, this knowledge informed the design of the pier, and Jody Pinto, who did this wonderful landboy sculpture at the end of the pier, her grandparents arrived in Philadelphia from Italy. She didn't know that they had arrived there either. This was a surprise to her. The winding stairs suggest the interiors of immigrants' houses. It's a multi-purpose. If any of you have ever been there, it's really amazing. It's just a stairway that seems to go up and lead nowhere. But it's, you get to the top, it's 24 feet above the street level. You can look down the river, and you can sort of anticipate what it must have been like waiting for a ship to come up from the Delaware Bay to the river and stop there right at Pier 53. But it's also a spiral staircase that could have been inside one of the immigrants' houses. So it's 24 feet. So this would be a 3-story trinity. And you get to the top of the stairway, and you would be at the top floor of your Trinity house in South Philly. And then there's a solar powered light, and it lights up at night, so you can see it from the river. It's really cool. And this was taken by a neighbor who's a river pilot, and he was sailing down the river. And this is what the pier looks like, as if it would have been taken from a drone. This is a sort of low tide, but the piers, the wooden piers that extend all the way out, they would extend out 700 feet from the shore. That would be the full length of the pier, and you can see the ruins right now. The land buoy and the end of the pier is right there, but you still have another 500 feet to go to get out to what would have been the end of the pier. And the immigrants all have stories, and they have families and scrapbooks, and do they have stories? Many of the people who live in the area today are their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. I was just told, we're interviewing one of the people for this film, and he mentioned that there are about 1,000 families in South Philadelphia who have lived in Philadelphia for 7 generations.
Susan, I'm going to interject. So I'm getting questions from people. They're really anxious and eager to hear about stories. Will you be able to share some of those stories with us tonight?
I have a few right here.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
And what I've been doing, I've been making little passenger tags. I interview people, make up a passenger tag that looks pretty much, well, not really, but it represents what they would be wearing if they came into the United States. And then on the back of the passenger tag is the bio. And this is the peer group. The peer group is our group of people who are descendants of the immigrants. And these are the descendants of the passengers who landed at Pier 53. And these are some of the stories. If you're a member of the peer group and you can prove you're a descendant, and I could help you with that, you get a t-shirt. that says the peer group descendant. And these are some of the stories. This is a cousin of mine, great-great-great-grandfather, John Pop. He was 17, lived the rest of his life in Philadelphia, worked as an ornamental wood carver. I mean, these are only a few of the stories. There are dozens. This is Heather Moqtadari and her daughter. She and her husband wrote a book about the history of Pensport. And her great-great-grandfather was a Methodist preacher from Scotland. And he preached at a church of what is now Termini's Bakery on 9th Street. And Dr. Greta Leopold, she lives in Queen Village. She's a psychiatrist, retired psychiatrist. Her father came in on Pier 53 and served. He was German, and he volunteered for the U.S. Army, and he was sent to France, and he was fighting Germans. But he was disabled by mustard gas, and he came to Philadelphia and spent the rest of his life there. And while he was in Europe, he kept a diary and correspondence with his brother, who had been stationed in Germany. He was a German-born immigrant who ended up fighting the Germans in Germany. Kelly Ashford, great-great-great-grandfather, left Bavaria in 1887 with his wife, his daughter, his 3 sons, because he did not want his sons to serve in the Prussian army. This is my second cousin. And that's only a few. What I do, there's every year, and it probably won't happen this year because of the lockdown, 3rd graders from Germantown Friends dress as immigrants, and I give them passenger tags. And they become the people who are on the passenger tags. And here's a few of the stories. This is the Red Star Line. You can read that. He was in his 80s. He was 81 when he came in. And the Board of Inquiry didn't really want to let him in because they thought he would not be productive. But his son called for him and took him to Egg Harbor City, which was a German settlement in Egg Harbor City. And he died there at the age of 94. John Schuster, Egg Harbor City again. There were vineyards there and a bottling plant. All these German immigrants just transferred their skills as winemakers and brewers and moved to this little town, Egg Harbor City. I have a lot of stories. I don't know how much time you have, but I've collected about 90 stories, and none of them are dull. Everyone is interesting, and everybody had a different reason for leaving their country and a different reason for coming here, and different stories. The most interesting one I had recently was a 3-year-old who came with his parents, and they were fleeing the pogroms in Ukraine, but a Jewish settlement in Ukraine. And his father owned a grocery store that had been firebombed. So he sold everything that he had, and he took the whole family, and they just showed up in Philadelphia. And one of the uncles had already moved out to the Scranton area and had a grocery store, and urged his father to come to Scranton and that he would give them one of the grocery stores. So that's what he did. He came with his children. And this little 3-year-old boy ended up becoming a band leader. And he started a group called the Scranton Sirens and introduced Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey to the world. You know, I mean, it's just amazing. These people wind up with these amazing stories that you never, ever could have predicted. So if any of your ancestors came to America by way of Pier 53 between 1876 and 1926, I invite you to tell the story, and you can become a member of the peer group and you get a t-shirt thanks to a Philadelphia Parks and Rec activities grant. And that's what's on the t-shirt. It's the pediment for the Pier 53 with the 3 lines on it, and it identifies you as a descendant. And that's the website. And many thanks to a lot of people. And that's it.
This is amazing. Thank you so much, Susan. I mean, this is not the end of the presentation. We do have a couple of questions, but
Okay.
before we move forward, I mean, a big round of applause. I'm so impressed. I mean, I'm also, I mean, you can say I'm an immigrant myself, but I came via Turkish Airlines from Istanbul to JFK, New York, about 30 years ago, but that's beside the point. So we do have a couple of guests, and they had questions. I'll just go ahead and ask you. One of the questions is, what the ships mainly took back to Europe on the return trip? Was it mainly freight or passengers? What did the ships take back?
I don't know what freight went back. Probably sugar, refined sugar, manufactured parts, coal. But they also took passengers back. And people would, in some cases, the steamship lines would send people back that they didn't want to come back into the United States. So they would just send them back on the same line. But oftentimes there were people who just wanted to go to Europe, or people who were returning to Europe. We had one Irish family that took the Haverford a couple of times because they came here in 1900 and then they wanted to go back and visit their relatives, and they did, and then they came back through Philadelphia and then they went back to Ireland. It's very much like you would do now, except you would fly, but they just took the ship from Philadelphia. And it was mostly the Haverford. This was the Bolt bus of the American line.
Well, thank you for that one. And the other question, when did the Lazaretto in Tinicum go into service?
Oh, the Lazaretto, I forgot to mention that. There were actually 3 Lazarettos.
Oh.
The word Lazaretto is a common noun. It means a place of quarantine, spelled with a small L. The first Lazaretto, which I think people, when they say the Lazaretto, they think of the first one, and that was in Tinicum. That was in Essington, and that was active up until 1892. That opened in 1800 because there were all kinds of cholera epidemics that hit Philadelphia, and there were plagues and diseases coming in from Europe. So rather than have these people land in Philadelphia, they stopped at this quarantine station, and it was routine. Any of the ships coming into Philadelphia would have to stop there. They would anchor in the channel. People from the Lazaretto would come out in little steamships or rowboats and look over the passengers and ask if anyone happened to be sick, and then they'd sort of eyeball the population to see if anybody was sick. And then they take them off and they keep them in the quarantine station. So people were sometimes on the passenger list, but they were delayed because they were quarantined. And then they either died or they got better. And if they got better, they would just put them on the next ship from the same steamship line, and they'd come into Philadelphia and their family would meet them. And I ran into a story where one of the children had an infected finger, and they kept him in quarantine for about 13 days. And then he was cured of this. He was put on a ship, and the family met him. They had already been established in Philadelphia for 13 days. It was closed down in 1892, and it was replaced by a Lazaretto in Marcus Hook. And that ran up until about, I'm not sure when that closed, but a much larger one was planned. But of course, they had all these plans that were frustrated by the outbreak of World War I. But the third Lazaretto was in New Jersey. It was in Gloucester City. And it was a 5-acre site that was privately owned. It was a man who actually donated his land to the federal government. The federal government was actually supposed to pay him for it, but they never did. And when the First World War soldiers were coming up, they stopped in Gloucester City. That was the lazaretto where they stopped before they came into Philadelphia. But it was in New Jersey, it wasn't in Pennsylvania. So there were 3 lazarettos.
Thank you. So there are 2 questions, actually. They go hand in hand. So does anyone have ancestors who came through here? And if they did, somebody's asking, how do you find out if your relatives came through Pier 53?
Well, the best way to do it is to go on to Ancestry.com and do a search for the name and the approximate, either the birth date, or if you know when the person came in and you're not sure if they came in through Pier 53, just put in a date for immigration and see what happens. If they came into Philadelphia and they came in on the American line, the Red Star line, the White Star line, the Hamburg American line, or the North German line, there were a few North German lines that came in to Philadelphia, then you came in on Pier 53. So then you get a t-shirt. If you tell me your story, you have to tell me the story.
And our audience members, anyone does have any ideas about any of your relatives who came through Pier 53 that you would like to share? You may be too shy to do that now. I mean, we can take a note and get back to you, or I'm sure Susan will be happy to chat with you right now. If that's the case, just please unmute yourselves and ask questions.
No one? Oh, I have. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead. Go ahead, Susan.
Oh,
yeah.
I have some stories. I have 3. I think I sent them to you earlier.
Yes.
I have 3 stories. Not stories. I just have passenger tags that I made up for 3 people. I can show you what they are. And there are 3 people that came in at totally different times under totally different circumstances, but it sort of gives you a rough idea of the variety of immigrants that came in on Pier 53. Okay, now I'm going to do the share screen thing again. Here we go.
Susan, I can also share these with our friends because I will share the recording with everyone. It's recorded, so that would be a nice addition. And Jill has a comment. If anyone, oh, sorry. Where did I see this? I didn't hear much about Germans or Poles, maybe my ancestry. Did I miss that, or was this important? Another call for them?
Oh, there were lots of Germans. The Germans mostly came in on the Red Star line from Antwerp. There were lots and lots of Germans. There were Germans from Bavaria, like my grandfather, but there were Germans also from all parts of Germany, from Frankfurt and from northern part, Berlin. There were a lot of German Jews that came in, people who lived in Germany but were part of the German Pale, I guess you would call it. There were a lot of Poles, the same story. There were Polish Jews. And interestingly, if you were Polish and Jewish, you would be, according to the Department of Justice names, racial names, you would be considered Hebrew from Poland. So on your passenger tag or on the passenger manifest, it would say so-and-so name, nationality Polish, race Jewish. But if you were a Polish Catholic, you would be Polish, because the Jews tended not to identify themselves as part of the ethnic group in the country where they lived. They were independent. They considered themselves Jews. And whether they expressly stated that when they came into the United States on the manifest, or whether that was assigned to them, I'm not sure. But there was definitely a difference between Polish and Polish Hebrew. That was also true of people from Ukraine. Ukraine had a very large Jewish settlement, just in parts of Ukraine, not all of it. But one of the people I interviewed, her grandmother came from Galicia, which is part of what is now Ukraine. And she identified herself as Ukrainian, but she was Catholic. And there were people from Ukraine who were Jewish who identified themselves as Jewish. And what was so interesting, with the confusion with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, people would come into the United States and they would be part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But when they went to take out citizenship, they would have to renounce allegiance to something. And if it had been after the Treaty of Versailles, they would have to renounce allegiance to whatever the government was in the town where they came from. And it got really confusing. And there was one person who was from Russia, was Russian Jewish, I believe, and he had to renounce his allegiance to, he didn't know because it was in 1918 and the Bolsheviks had taken over in Russia. Nobody knew who was in charge. So on the naturalization certificate, he said, I renounce allegiance to whoever runs the country right now. Because the boundaries kept changing. I mean, not only were the identities fluid when these people came here, and sometimes they didn't know they were assigned identities, but when they became Americans, they really had to stretch to describe what country they were from. The Poles came over. They generally stayed, at least in Philadelphia, they had Polish enclaves, and the first generation anyway, and in some cases second generation, stayed pretty close to the Catholic Church and to the Polish organizations that existed. And then beyond that, they intermarried as everybody did. When you get to there's a debate on what is considered first generation. Is first generation the people who come from Europe or come from outside of the United States and establish citizenship here? Are they first generation, or is the first generation their children? And nobody actually has been able to solve that. I don't know what constitutes first generation. The children of the immigrants tended to wander further away from their language. They lost the language and they lost the culture, and in some cases they lost the religion. But in some cases they stayed within the same religion. Now, one of the people who's going to be featured in this film, her grandmother was from Russia. She was born in Russia, but she was German. She had a German name. The name was Blau. And she was part of a group called the Volga Germans, which is another complicated story. These are German nationals who had been given farmland in Russia. So they came to the United States. And then the next generation, her grandmother was 5, I think, when she came in. But everybody within that family married within the Catholic Church, but they married, one person married somebody who was Ukrainian, one person married somebody who was Italian. Her grandfather was Italian, he owned a barber shop. They married Scots-Irish, they married every ethnic group you could possibly imagine within one generation, and they all stayed in South Philadelphia, which makes this thing so interesting. But every ethnic group within the Catholic Church is represented in this one family, and they all still live on 2nd Street. She's going to be in the film.
This is wonderful, Susan. I think we can go on and on. I think we're going to need one other session or two, maybe. But I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you and Gabriela Cesarino. Gabriela, thank you so much for organizing this. You two created a great content. We very much appreciate your time and input. So thank you again.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. Really,
Thank you.
my pleasure.
Wait to see the movie, and hopefully we'll make another announcement if we could be part of it. The screening at some point, and maybe physically visit the site. Gabriela will work on that, and we'll make those announcements. But before we go, I would like to announce 3 events that are coming up because I have to. That's my job. Next one, November 14. We will have an international photographer. He will be sharing his photography and his journey following the footsteps of a German, or yes, he is referred to as German, Kurt Hilscher. Kurt Hilscher's footsteps, followed by Casper Molenaar from the Netherlands. He will be sharing his presentation on November 14 at 2 o'clock. It's an afternoon presentation. It's also on our website. And in December, I believe it's going to be December 8th. I will confirm with our presenter, Jennifer Stein, as part of our Marco Polo series. She will talk about Peru, Urubamba Valley. So that will be another interesting one. And we will probably add one more, which I will not announce a date or content yet, but we have an honoree that is coming up in next year's our biggest event, the Legacy event. It's a Guinness World Record holder, and she is the youngest traveler and the youngest female to travel the world at the fastest pace. So more on that coming up soon. So thank you once again. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I will share the recording with every one of you. Keep an eye on your inboxes, and any questions, comments, get back to me at geosocial@gmail.com. And thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
That was
Thank
awesome.
you.
That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great seeing you all.
You.
Okay. Good
Yeah.
night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Night all.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.